Exodus is a sequel to the Genesis novella. Link in the description for my review of that. This time around, the author moves from ineptly writing fantasy fiction to ineptly writing a horror story. Genesis ended with Yahweh, the dim-witted Dark Lord, having failed at everything he ever tried to do, other than killing people, which is his preferred pastime. Now recall that at the end of the Genesis novella, 70 descendants of Abraham had to flee a famine Yahweh caused, and they all wound up in Egypt. Well, in Exodus, it reveals that those 70 progenitors committed incest for generations until their inbred offspring number a couple of million people, and these inbred offspring are claimed to be the Hebrew people. Why there hasn't been an uproar over such anti-Semitism, I don't know. After the events in Genesis, Yahweh spends 400 years being a quiet deity who keeps to himself. Finally, he just snaps. Yahweh wants a large supply of sycophants to tell him he is a good God, and the best God, and the only God, and a stereotypically masculine God, and a handsome God, and a smart God, and a good magician, and a good serial killer, and a master of strategy, and an excellent pyromaniac. Oddly enough, Yahweh wants the whole lot of them to fawn before him with feigned flattery, done with an artifice of admiration, so he can pretend their worship is sincere, and he will commit mass murder until they comply. So he slithers out from wherever it is that he has been keeping to himself. He quickly finds himself a man named Moses. Moses is a murderer who is fond of talking to vegetation. So Yahweh knows this is the kind of man he can partner up with. So Yahweh and Moses concoct an overly elaborate evil plan for murder and mayhem. Nevertheless, despite having hit it off so well with Moses, Yahweh decides to murder Moses for no apparent reason. Fortunately, Moses has a wife who is just as sick in the head as Yahweh. She chops off the ends of Moses' sons' penises and rubs them on Moses' body. For no given, implied, or inferable reason, doing this pleases Yahweh, and he decides not to murder Moses after all. So, now that they are partners in psychosis again, they begin their implausible campaign of horrors. Moses meets up with his brother Aaron, which is itself rather implausible because Aaron was drowned as a baby, and apparently spent his time thereafter floating around in the Nile. Anyway, Moses was implausibly adopted by a princess and would not have known who his brother was, even if Aaron somehow managed to get himself undrowned. With that plot hole glaring for all to see, the Exodus novella continues. Dead, alive, or undead, Aaron teams up with Yahweh and his brother Moses. They demand that the king of this fantasy version of Egypt let the inbred Hebrews go on a vacation, all 2 million of them at once. Of course, this is only a pretext for the bloodbath that Yahweh and Moses have conspired to commit. Moses then does some magic tricks and spouts lame one-liners so over the top that even William Shatner would have said we're going too far. The Exodus novella then very repetitiously and more importantly, boringly, tells us about how Moses and Yahweh go on an assortment of impractical and ludicrous killing sprees. Yahweh loves the smell of genocide in the morning. As part of this magical campaign of death, the Egyptians' livestock are killed. First, Yahweh personally slaughters all the livestock in some unspecified way. Later, despite already being dead, Yahweh kills them once again, this time with a magical thunderstorm, with spooky lightning and improbable hail. Then, despite having already killed them all twice, Yahweh kills the firstborn of all the Egyptians' animals, and the firstborn of the Egyptian people too. Finally, there is an excitement-free chase scene where the Egyptians use chariots pulled, you guessed it, by their triply dead horses. This time Yahweh drowns them. I can only suppose that dying this fourth time works because we hear of the horses no more. But at last, these anti-Semitically caricatured Hebrew slaves are free from their ineptly written Egyptian masters. And if you think the reader is now free from the tedious storytelling utilized so far, you are in for a surprise. That is, assuming you don't have to wake up after reading this far. So, let us gird up our unwilling suspension of disbelief and press on. For now begins the real bloodbath. Not an interesting bloodbath, but a bloodbath nonetheless. Yes, the Hebrews are free from slavery, but an even worse fate has befallen them, for they are now in the clutches of the dim-witted Dark Lord Yahweh and his murderous toady Moses. Somebody should have told the Hebrews this wasn't going to end well. Yahweh and Moses lead their millions of hapless victims out into a desert with no food, water, or hope of rescue. Moses makes the people, all 2 million of them, follow clouds around during the day and do this moth-like thing where, at night, they run towards fires. It is kind of like Gilligan's Island, only instead of having a 3-hour tour, they must welter, lumber, and trudge through what will eventually turn out to be a 40-year excursion led by none other than Yahweh, the homicidal tour guide. But I gather that comes during one of the next novellas in this series, because it is only mentioned in passing in Exodus. Anyway, starving, dehydrating, and utterly alone, the Hebrews despair of life itself. Eventually, and most begrudgingly, Yahweh feeds them in a very odd manner. Each night, he puts out something like pancake mix on the ground, only it is infested with very fast-growing maggots, so the Hebrews have no choice but to eat this maggot-infested pancake mix right away before the magical maggots gobble it up. It is kind of like the way the Morlocks from The Time Machine by H.G. Wells feed the Eloi, only to kill them later. This is no work of kindness, for Yahweh is just keeping them alive long enough for him to kill them whenever the mood strikes him. The Hebrews have just enough time to recuperate from thirst and starvation before having to go to war with the Amalekites. Whoever they are and why they go to war with the Hebrews, the inept author of Exodus couldn't be bothered to tell us. Yahweh isn't too particular about who wins, as long as he gets to watch people die. So Yahweh sets Moses up like a conductor of an orchestra of death. If Moses raises his hand, the Amalekites die. If he lowers it, the Hebrews die. Either way, lots of people are brutally slaughtered while Moses and Yahweh joyously watch. Having your characters go to war is supposed to be exciting, one would think. So naturally, the inept author of Exodus has the entire war last for 2 paragraphs. Next, Moses climbs up a radioactive mountain. We can infer that because he is glowing when he finally comes down. And apparently is glowing so much he has to wrap himself in sheets so he doesn't blind the Hebrews. But while he is atop this radioactive mountain, guess what happens? No, never mind. You can't do it. A team of the world's best authors and literary experts couldn't guess what the author writes next if they worked for 100 years. So what happens? Moses and Yahweh spend the next 12 chapters talking about how to make a tent and some fancy clothes. They also talk about how to cut the guts out of animals and wave them around in a sort of interpretive dance. Anyway, after those 12 chapters of tedium, Moses comes down off the mountain to discover that the Hebrews have made a statue. This seems as good a reason as any to engage in more homicide. So Moses forces 1,000 men to each kill their brother, their best friend, and their neighbor. These 3,000 murders satisfy Yahweh for a bit. Apparently, the author of Exodus realized he was in danger of becoming very near, almost, vaguely interesting. So he has Moses instruct the Hebrews, despite being lost in a desert without any resources, to make the tent and fancy clothes he and Yahweh came up with. And then the rest of Exodus goes into mind-numbingly dull details about the making of the clothes and the tent. Yahweh, it seems, is not just a serial killer, he also fancies himself a fashion designer and interior decorator. So ends Exodus. Yahweh's adventures as a homicidal tour guide continue in Leviticus, the third novella in the Bible novel. We will discuss what I am so very sure will be its thrilling and captivating storytelling next time. See you then.